In the spring of 1847, a medical practitioner, Dr. Augustus Levine, made a peculiar entry in his personal journal. This record, destined to remain concealed within the New Orleans Municipal Archives for a span of 132 years, chronicled an inexplicable phenomenon. Over a period of 18 months, he had assisted in the delivery of 47 infants to enslaved women across 7 plantations situated in St. Charles Parish. Astonishingly, each of these newborns presented with fair skin, light-colored eyes, and features strikingly similar to those of Caucasian infants. Every single one of them vanished within days of their birth. When Dr. Levine endeavored to present his observations to the parish officials, he was informed that his services were no longer required. 3 weeks thereafter, his lifeless body was discovered submerged in the Mississippi River, his meticulously kept ledger conspicuously absent. Nevertheless, these unusual births persisted. They continued for an additional decade, disseminating across Louisiana like a carefully orchestrated affliction. And the children, numbering in the hundreds, simply dissolved into a clandestine network so intricate that even contemporary historians struggle to ascertain their ultimate destinations. Before we delve further into the narrative of Dr. Augustus Levine and the infants who seemingly were never intended to exist, I implore you to take a moment. If you possess a fascination for obscure historical enigmas that challenge our established understanding of the past, I encourage you to engage that subscribe button and activate notifications, ensuring you never miss a captivating story of this nature. Furthermore, I am genuinely curious to know your current listening location. Kindly share your state or city in the comments section below. Now let us embark on a journey to unravel the truth behind the events that transpired within those plantation houses lining the river, and the reasons why an entire system exerted such formidable efforts to maintain their secrecy. The reality of those births would eventually come to light, but not in a manner anyone could have anticipated. It would necessitate a destructive conflagration, a desperate woman's confession, and a ledger that should have been permanently lost to time. However, before we can comprehend the network responsible for the clandestine removal of these children, it is essential to understand the societal framework that gave rise to it. A society where human beings were considered mere commodities, where immense wealth was amassed through profound suffering, and where the hue of a child's skin dictated their destiny between enslavement and liberty. New Orleans during the 1840s was a city of stark paradoxes, a locale where refined French elegance clashed with burgeoning American ambition, where opulent opera houses stood mere blocks from bustling slave markets, and where fortunes were both forged and lost upon the very backs of individuals treated as chattel. The city had ascended to become the most affluent in the southern United States. Its prosperity was solely derived from the cultivation of cotton and sugar, sustained by the labor of enslaved people, who, in numerous parishes, outnumbered the free Caucasian population. By 1840, the port of New Orleans ranked as the 4th busiest globally, with vessels arriving daily from Europe, the Caribbean islands, and the interior of the American continent. Towering stacks of cotton bales reaching heights of 20 feet lined the docks awaiting shipment to Liverpool and Le Havre. Warehouses from the French Quarter to the American sector brimmed with barrels of sugar. And within the marketplaces situated near the river, human beings stood upon auction blocks, sold to the highest bidder, while their families could only watch in helpless despair. The city's populace had experienced a dramatic surge in growth in the decades following the Louisiana Purchase. French Creoles who had held sway over the city for generations now found themselves sharing space with American businessmen, along with Irish and German immigrants, free people of color who had cultivated their own distinct communities, and the enslaved population whose labor made all of it possible. The languages echoing through the streets formed a cacophony of French, English, Spanish, German, and various African dialects. The architectural landscape mirrored this cultural amalgamation. Spanish colonial edifices adorned with ornate wrought iron balconies, French townhouses with their secluded courtyards, and newer American constructions embracing the Greek Revival style that was sweeping the nation. Yet beneath this veneer of opulent charm, New Orleans was a city constructed upon a foundation of brutality and exploitation. The Code Noir, originally enacted under French dominion, had undergone modifications, but its essence remained intact under American governance. It meticulously regulated every facet of the lives of enslaved individuals, dictating their attire, their permissible movements, whom they could wed, and the methods of their chastisement. The city had cultivated a reputation for exhibiting greater leniency compared to other southern locales, permitting enslaved individuals to retain earnings from their own labor and, in some instances, to purchase their freedom. However, this perceived benevolence masked the grim reality that the majority of enslaved people endured. St. Charles Parish, situated upstream from the city, was home to some of Louisiana's most lucrative sugar plantations. This region, known as the German Coast, had been a producer of sugar since the late 1700s. By the 1840s, the plantation proprietors in this area had perfected their operations into remarkably efficient, albeit ruthless, enterprises. The Dufour plantation, the Haddell estate, the Fourier holdings, the Becknell property, and the Troxler lands. These were far more than mere agricultural tracts. They functioned as self-contained principalities, each governed by its own distinct set of regulations, its own economic system, and its own closely guarded secrets. The cultivation of sugar was an arduous and perilous undertaking, significantly more demanding and physically taxing than cotton farming. The sugarcane had to be harvested within a very brief autumn window and processed immediately thereafter to prevent spoilage. The period of sugar processing, known as the grinding season, operated around the clock for weeks on end. Enslaved workers toiled in shifts around massive iron vats filled with boiling cane juice within structures where temperatures could soar to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Accidents were regrettably commonplace. Hands became ensnared and crushed in the grinding machinery, bodies suffered scalding from the boiling syrup, and workers frequently collapsed from sheer exhaustion and the oppressive heat. The plantation owners residing in palatial homes that overlooked these operations were among the wealthiest individuals in America. They journeyed to Europe, dispatched their offspring to prestigious educational institutions, amassed collections of art and rare books, and considered themselves sophisticated gentlemen. Many of them held a genuine conviction that slavery was a benevolent system, that they were providing care for individuals incapable of self-sufficiency, and that the entire institution was divinely ordained and sanctioned by nature. Yet they were also aware, though they seldom articulated it openly, that their affluence was entirely dependent on the absolute control they exerted over the people they held in bondage. Any lapse in that control, any suggestion that enslaved individuals possessed full humanity along with the same rights and aspirations as white people, posed a profound threat to the entire established order. Dr. Augustus Levine had relocated to New Orleans from Mobile in 1844. A young physician possessing excellent credentials from his medical studies at a Philadelphia institution, he was 29 years old, unmarried, and driven by ambition. His initial aspiration was to establish a medical practice catering to the affluent Creole families of the French Quarter. However, much like many aspiring young doctors, he discovered that the established medical practitioners had tightly secured the patronage of these families. The long-standing medical dynasties, such as the Mercier, the Labatus, and the Soles, had been providing care to the Creole elite for generations, and they were disinclined to permit a newcomer from Alabama to supplant them. Consequently, Dr. Levine adopted the course of action common among struggling physicians. He accepted work wherever it was available. Plantation medicine, while lacking prestige, offered a consistent income. The affluent planters required medical attention to ensure their enslaved workforce remained healthy enough to perform their labor, and they compensated reasonably well for house calls. It was not the distinguished practice Dr. Levine had envisioned, but it provided a livelihood. He commenced making regular visits to 5 plantations in St. Charles Parish, attending to a range of ailments from fevers and injuries to the delivery of newborns. He maintained meticulous records, a practice instilled during his medical education. Every patient, every symptom, and every treatment was meticulously recorded in his ledger. His instructors in Philadelphia had underscored the critical importance of detailed documentation. Medicine was increasingly evolving into a more scientific and systematic discipline, and comprehensive records were indispensable for discerning disease patterns and evaluating treatment efficacy. It was this ingrained habit, this compulsive dedication to documentation, that would ultimately render him a person of interest. Dr. Levine was not an abolitionist. Having grown up in the South, he found slavery distasteful, but accepted it as an economic reality. He treated his enslaved patients with the same professional diligence he afforded his white patients, yet he did not question the very system that necessitated their status as patients. In his own estimation, he was merely a physician fulfilling his professional duties. The enslaved populace on these plantations existed within an environment of perpetual scrutiny and subjugation. The slave quarters, where they resided, were arranged in uniform rows designed to facilitate maximum surveillance. Each humble cabin accommodated multiple families, with thin partition walls offering no semblance of privacy. The overseer's residence was strategically positioned to afford a view of the quarters, and nightly patrols ensured that no one ventured about without authorization. Their movements were strictly controlled by a pass system. Any enslaved individual found beyond the plantation's boundaries without a written pass risked severe corporal punishment, or worse. Their personal relationships were closely monitored, and their children were frequently separated from them and sold away before reaching adolescence. The women in particular endured a distinct form of terror not experienced by the men. The agonizing knowledge that their bodies were not their own, that they could be violated by white men with absolute impunity, and that any offspring resulting from such brutality would be born into perpetual servitude from their very first breath. This was not a hidden secret, it was a widely acknowledged reality. The fair-skinned children who served in the plantation houses and attended to the master's table were tangible proof of these transgressions, yet the matter was never openly discussed. The white families perpetuated the pretense that these children were merely the product of relationships between enslaved individuals, even when the infants bore an uncanny resemblance to the plantation owner or his sons. However, something profoundly anomalous was transpiring on these plantations, something that even the enslaved women themselves initially struggled to comprehend. The infants being born were not merely light-skinned, they were undeniably Caucasian, possessing features that unmistakably distinguished them as white, and these children were subsequently disappearing. In March of 1846, Dr. Levine was summoned to the Dufour plantation to attend to a woman named Celeste, who was experiencing a difficult labor with her first child. The summons arrived in the dead of night, conveyed by a young enslaved boy who had traversed 3 miles from the plantation to Dr. Levine's lodgings in New Orleans. The boy, breathless and visibly distressed, stated only that Celeste was enduring a challenging labor and required assistance from the midwife. Dr. Levine, gathering his medical satchel, set out for the plantation under the cover of darkness. The route followed the winding course of the river, passing through groves of live oaks festooned with ethereal Spanish moss. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of the river and the sweet, pervasive aroma of sugar processing. In the distance, the lights of other plantation houses flickered like scattered lanterns against the nocturnal expanse. He arrived at the Dufour plantation just before dawn. The main house was enveloped in darkness, but lights glowed from the slave quarters. An elderly enslaved woman named Ruth met him at the entrance of one of the cabins. She was the plantation's primary midwife, a woman who had presided over the births of hundreds of children during her 60-odd years. Her face was deeply etched with the lines of time, her hands gnarled with arthritis, yet her eyes possessed a keen, assessing sharpness. "She has been in labor since yesterday afternoon," Ruth stated softly, guiding Dr. Levine into the cabin. "The baby is positioned incorrectly. I cannot turn it." Within the confined space of the cabin, the air was oppressively close, despite the cool March night. A fire crackled in the small hearth, heating water in a large pot. Celeste lay on a narrow bed, her face glistening with sweat, her body rigid with the throes of pain. She was 22 years old, dark-skinned, and had been born on the plantation. This was her first child, and she was consumed by fear. Dr. Levine conducted a swift professional examination. Ruth's assessment was accurate. The baby was in a breech presentation, necessitating a manual repositioning, a delicate and potentially perilous procedure. He had performed it previously, albeit infrequently, and the risk of losing both mother and infant was significant. He worked for 2 hours, with Ruth providing assistance and Celeste biting down on a leather strap to suppress her cries. The overseer, a man named Garrett, made a brief appearance to inquire about the progress of the labor before departing once more. The plantation owner, Jean-Baptiste Dufour, never materialized, deeming the birth of an enslaved child beneath his consideration. Finally, shortly after midnight, Dr. Levine succeeded in repositioning the infant. Celeste, through 3 more agonizing contractions, expelled the child. A healthy baby girl emerged, her lungs strong and her color robust. However, as Dr. Levine cleaned and examined the infant, a chilling sense of bewilderment washed over him. The child was pale, not merely a light brown or exhibiting mixed-race features, but genuinely fair, with skin the color of cream and eyes that would undoubtedly be blue once they gained focus. Her features were delicate, refined, suggestive of European ancestry, and remarkably recent. The distinct shape of her nose, the precise set of her eyes, the texture of her hair, every aspect of her appearance indicated recent Caucasian lineage. He glanced at Celeste, then back at the infant. Celeste's face was impassive, a mask of exhaustion mingled with something else, perhaps fear or a profound resignation. She avoided his gaze. "The father?" Dr. Levine inquired softly, although he harbored a strong suspicion regarding the answer. Celeste offered no response. Ruth, who was attending to the afterbirth, simply shook her head, a gesture that clearly communicated to Dr. Levine that he should refrain from further inquiry. He meticulously recorded the birth in his ledger, noting the time, the difficulties encountered during delivery, and the infant's condition. He then appended a sentence that would later prove eerily prescient. "Female infant delivered to Celeste, property of J. Dufour. Healthy, unusual presentation. Child appears white in complexion and features. Father unknown." He departed the cabin as the sun began to ascend, feeling both exhausted and deeply troubled. He had previously assisted in the deliveries of children born to enslaved women, including some who were undeniably of mixed racial heritage. But this instance was profoundly different. This child possessed the ability to pass as Caucasian in any social setting. Had he encountered her in the arms of a white mother, he would never have questioned her parentage. 3 days later, upon his return to check on Celeste's recovery, the infant was gone. Celeste sat on the porch of her cabin, her gaze fixed on an unseen point in the distance. Her breasts were tightly bound, and she moved with a stiffness suggestive of lingering pain. "Where is the baby?" Dr. Levine inquired. Celeste remained silent, her vacant stare unwavering. Dr. Levine located the overseer to Garrett near the sugar mill. "The infant I delivered to Celeste, where is she?" Garrett, barely lifting his eyes from the ledger he was reviewing, responded, "Died in the night. Weak constitution, we buried her already." "Died of what?" Dr. Levine pressed, a prickle of unease manifesting. "Weak constitution," Garrett repeated flatly. "It happens all the time with these people. They aren't as robust as whites, you know that." But Dr. Levine had personally examined that infant. She had been perfectly healthy, exhibiting strong lungs and good color. Her reflexes had been normal, her temperature stable. There was no medical justification for her demise. "I would like to examine the body," Dr. Levine stated. Garrett finally looked up, his expression hardening. "Body's buried. No point digging it up. You were paid for the delivery, weren't you?" "That's all you need to worry about." Dr. Levine felt compelled to press the issue further, but a subtle warning in Garrett's tone discouraged him. He noted the infant's death in his ledger, yet he remained unconvinced. That night, reclining in his rented room in New Orleans, he found himself replaying the image of the infant's face, Celeste's blank expression, and the overseer's swift, dismissive explanation. Something was profoundly amiss, though he could not yet articulate precisely what. 2 months later, the perplexing situation recurred. This time, on the Haddle plantation, a woman named Josephine gave birth to a boy who bore an exact resemblance to the first infant, pale, with light-colored eyes and delicate features that would have been perfectly at home in a Caucasian family portrait. Dr. Levine delivered the child on a humid May evening, with thunderstorms gathering ominously from the direction of the Gulf. The air within the cabin was thick and suffocating, and Josephine's screams throughout her labor possessed a desperate ferocity that deeply unsettled him. Josephine was older than Celeste, perhaps 30 years of age, and this was her 4th child. Her 3 preceding children, all darker-skinned and unmistakably of African descent, had been sold away over the years. She informed Dr. Levine of this fact with a dispassionate tone, as if it was simply an unavoidable aspect of her existence. Upon the child's birth, Josephine refused to look at him. She turned her face towards the wall and wept silently while Ruth attended to the infant. "Josephine," Dr. Levine said gently, "your son is healthy. Would you not like to hold him?" "Take it away," Josephine whispered. "Just take it away." Ruth wrapped the infant and handed him to the overseer, who had been waiting outside. The man accepted the child without a word and vanished into the darkness. Dr. Levine stood there, his medical bag still in hand, with the distinct impression of having witnessed something fundamentally wrong, yet lacking the words to precisely define it. He had, by this point, delivered dozens of children to enslaved women and had observed the full spectrum of human emotions: joy, sorrow, fear, and love. However, this experience was distinct. This was a profound rejection stemming from a source deeper than postpartum distress. He recorded the birth in his ledger with the same notation: male infant delivered to Josephine, property of a Hadel, healthy, unusual presentation, child appears white in complexion and features, father unknown. Upon his return a week later, he was informed that the child had succumbed. Once again, there was no body to examine. Once again, a burial had already taken place. "How did he die?" Dr. Levine inquired of the overseer, a different man from Garrett, but possessing the same stern countenance and dismissive demeanor. "Fever took him quickly," the man replied. "Nothing that could be done." Yet the infant had been in perfect health when Dr. Levine departed. There was no fever, no indication of illness. His temperature had been normal, his breathing clear, his color good. That night, Dr. Levine sat in his rented room in New Orleans, perusing his ledger by the flickering light of a candle. 2 births, 2 healthy infants, 2 deaths within a matter of days, both children exhibiting the same improbable appearance. He pondered Josephine's aversion to her child, Celeste's inscrutable expression, and the overseer's swift removal of the infants, their convenient declarations of death, and the hasty burials. He considered the fact that both plantation owners Dufour and Hadel were known to visit the slave quarters during the nighttime hours. This was common knowledge, though never openly discussed. It was one of those unacknowledged realities of plantation life. Something was gravely wrong. Over the ensuing year, Dr. Levine delivered 12 more infants exhibiting identical characteristics. 12 pale infants born to dark-skinned, enslaved women. 12 children who vanished within days, all officially documented as having perished from various causes: fever, weak constitution, failure to thrive, or respiratory distress. However, Dr. Levine had been trained to identify patterns, and this was a pattern that defied conventional medical explanation. Infant mortality rates were indeed high among enslaved populations. Factors such as inadequate nutrition, substandard housing, and limited access to medical care contributed to mortality rates 2 to 3 times higher than those of white infants. But this was not the pattern observed here. This involved infants born in apparent good health, who then died within days, always without a body available for examination, and never with bodies that disappeared so rapidly. Even during the oppressive heat of a Louisiana summer, there was typically sufficient time for a physician to examine a deceased infant, if requested. Yet these children were consistently buried before Dr. Levine could return. He began to make discreet inquiries. He spoke with Ruth, the elderly woman who assisted with many of the births, but she would only shake her head and urge him to let the matter rest. "You do not wish to know," she once stated when he pressed her. "Trust me, doctor."
"You do not wish to know." "But the children are gone," Ruth interjected. "That is all you need to grasp. They are gone, and asking questions will not bring them back. It will only bring trouble upon you." He attempted to converse with the mothers, but they consistently averted his gaze. When he inquired about their children, they would simply state that the child had died, repeating the phrase as if reciting a script. Their faces were devoid of expression, their voices flat and monotonous.
It was as if they had been conditioned to provide this specific response. The overseers exhibited increasing hostility towards his inquiries. One individual, a man identified as Dupré, employed at the Fourier estate, lent his support to Levine after inquiries were made concerning a child who was presumed to have perished. "Listen, doctor," Dupré stated, his voice carrying a low, menacing tone. "Your sole purpose here is to assist with childbirths and attend to the unwell. That is the extent of your duties. You are not authorized to question matters that transpire subsequently. Do you comprehend my meaning? Levine persisted. I am merely troubled by the elevated mortality figures. Dupré interjected. The rate of demise is not your concern. These individuals possess delicate physiques. Their infants succumb. That is simply the natural order. You may either accept this reality and continue to receive your remuneration, or you may persist with your interrogations and find yourself without employment. The decision rests with you. Levine ceased his public inquiries, but continued his meticulous record-keeping. Each birth, every physical description, and each questionable death were duly noted in his log. He also began to discern additional pattern. Deliveries consistently occurred under the cloak of night. The overseers were invariably present, waiting just outside the dwelling. The mothers were invariably left alone thereafter. No family members were permitted to visit. No other individuals held in servitude were allowed to see the newborn. Furthermore, the infants were invariably taken away by the overseer. They were never left with their mothers, not even for a few hours. In September of the year 1847, he attended the delivery of his 47th such infant, a female child born to a woman named Marie on the Fourier plantation. This infant was perhaps the most pale yet observed, with hair that would undoubtedly become fair as it grew, and eyes that already evinced a hint of green. Marie differed from the other mothers. She was younger, possibly 19 years of age, and had been born in Haiti, subsequently brought to Louisiana following the revolution there. She conversed in French with a distinct Caribbean inflection, and her gaze conveyed a fierce intelligence that had not yet been extinguished. She cradled her daughter for precisely 3 minutes, murmuring something in French that Levine could not precisely discern. She then looked directly at him, tears coursing down her cheeks.
Please, Marie implored in English, her accent pronounced but her words clear. Please, record it. Write down what you witness. Someone must know, someone must remember that she existed, that she was mine, that she was genuine. Levine experienced a profound emotional shift. I shall, he vowed. I have been documenting everything. Marie offered a slight nod, then relinquished her daughter to the overseer with an expression of such profound sorrow that Levine had to avert his gaze.
It was at that juncture that Levine resolved to take action. While he could not definitively prove what fate befell these children, he could document it. He could compile a record that would be impossible to dismiss. He could compel an authority figure to initiate an investigation. He dedicated 3 days to assembling his evidence: 47 births, 47 descriptions, 47 convenient deaths. He meticulously noted the dates, the estates, the names of the supervising officers present, and the names of the mothers. He composed a carefully worded letter articulating his concerns and soliciting an inquiry into what he termed irregularities in infant mortality rates among the subjugated populace of St. Charles Parish, specifically pertaining to infants exhibiting an unusually pale complexion. He deliberately avoided making any direct accusations. His approach was to present the observations as he had witnessed them, seeking an examination of the matter. He believed that by framing it as a medical issue rather than a moral one, he might secure a receptive audience. On the 3rd day of October 1847, he presented his findings to the parish magistrate, a gentleman named Judge Beaumont, who possessed a reputation for impartiality. Beaumont was a Creole gentleman in his 60s, having received his education in France, and was recognized for his scrupulous adherence to the law. Levine reasoned that if anyone were to treat this matter with seriousness, it would be him. Beaumont received him in his chambers within the parish courthouse, a structure of Spanish colonial architecture, characterized by substantial walls and elevated ceilings. The judge occupied his seat behind an imposing mahogany desk, his countenance impassive as Levine expounded upon his apprehensions. Subsequently, Levine presented the duplicated pages from his ledger. Beaumont perused them in silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the mantelpiece and the rustling of paper. Upon completion, he carefully arranged the pages, ensured their edges were aligned, and placed them upon his desk. He then met Levine's gaze with an expression that was neither outright anger nor overt sympathy, but rather something akin to commiseration. "Dr. Levine," Beaumont stated deliberately, "I shall offer you some counsel. Return to your medical practice, deliver the infants you are summoned to assist, maintain your records if you deem it necessary, but do not pursue this matter further." "But the children," Beaumont interrupted, his voice hardening. "The children are considered property. What becomes of them is the concern of their proprietors, not yours, not mine, not the jurisdiction of the law. Do you comprehend?" Levine felt a chilling sensation spread through his stomach. "Are you suggesting that these infants are not perishing, that they are being relocated?" Beaumont rose, signifying the conclusion of their discussion. "I am conveying that established systems are in operation, systems far exceeding the influence of yourself or myself, and that any attempt to disrupt these systems would pose considerable peril to you. These plantations generate substantial revenue for this parish, for this state, and indeed for the entire southern region. The individuals who own them wield considerable power and are not inclined to tolerate interference in their affairs. However, if children are being subjected to servitude, children are indeed property," Beaumont reiterated, his tone now frigid. "They may be disposed of through sale, trade, bestowal, or other means, as their owners deem appropriate. Such is the established legal framework. If the law is unsatisfactory to you, I suggest you relocate to Massachusetts. However, for as long as you practice medicine within Louisiana, you are bound to abide by its statutes."
Is my meaning unequivocally clear? Levine regarded him, a dawning comprehension finally illuminating his expression. Beaumont was aware of what transpired with the children and was complicit, or at the very least, he was safeguarding those responsible. "Perfectly clear," Levine responded quietly. He departed the courthouse, his duplicated pages in hand, feeling profoundly unwell. He had harbored a naive expectation that the presentation of evidence would result in the dispensation of justice.
The prevailing order was not structured to deliver justice. Rather, it was designed to safeguard assets and profits, and individuals held in servitude, including children, were regarded as mere commodities. Nevertheless, Levine could not simply dismiss the matter. That very night, he created a second facsimile of his ledger entries and concealed it within his personal quarters, meticulously sewing it into the lining of his mattress. The original document remained in his possession at all times, secured within a leather portfolio he carried universally. He also composed a letter addressed to his sister residing in Mobile, a sister who had succumbed to yellow fever when Levine was merely 12 years of age, a detail that any potential investigator would readily ascertain. Within this correspondence, he detailed all that he had discovered and all that he suspected. He elucidated the perceived clandestine network, identified the individuals involved, and articulated his profound concerns for his own personal safety. He then sealed the letter and secreted it within his ledger, precisely between the pages documenting birth number 32 and birth number 33. 2 weeks hence, he received notification that his professional services were no longer required on any of the plantations within St. Charles Parish. no justification was provided. The communication was delivered by a clerk dispatched from Judge Beaumont's office, and its nature was unequivocally not a request. Levine's income experienced a reduction exceeding 50%. He made attempts to secure alternative employment, but a pervasive rumor had circulated branding him as a troublemaker, someone who posed excessive questions. Other plantation proprietors consequently declined to engage his services. His urban medical practice continued to be modest in scale. 3 weeks thereafter, on the evening of October 27, 1847, Dr. Augustus Levine departed from his boarding house with the intention of meeting a colleague for an evening meal at a restaurant situated in the French Quarter. He carried his customary leather portfolio. He never reached his intended destination. His lifeless body was discovered the subsequent morning, entangled amongst the submerged pilings beneath a wharf along the Mississippi River. The officially recorded cause of death was attributed to accidental drowning, presumed to have resulted from excessive consumption of alcohol. A bottle of whiskey was found in proximity to where his body had entered the water, and witnesses reported observing an individual resembling Levine engaged in solitary drinking at a tavern earlier that evening. His medical satchel was located nearby, its contents scattered, and his leather portfolio was conspicuously absent. The proprietress of his boarding house, when questioned by the constabulary, indicated that she had observed 2 elegantly attired gentlemen departing from his room on the night of his demise. They had informed her that they were colleagues of the doctor collecting his personal effects for his family. She had not harbored any suspicions at the time. They had conducted themselves with courtesy, spoken articulately, and had presented her with $1 as a token of their appreciation. Upon searching Levine's quarters, the constabulary discovered that the room had been meticulously emptied. His clothing remained, but all of his documents had vanished. His medical treatises were still on the shelf, but any loose papers had been removed. The mattress had been deliberately incised, and its lining had been torn out. The concealed duplicate copy of his ledger pages was never recovered. It is conceivable that the gentlemen were exceptionally thorough in their search, or, alternatively, the proprietress may have disposed of it herself after the constabulary's departure, lacking an understanding of its significance. Dr. Augustus Levine was interred in St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 in an unmarked grave within the section designated for paupers and strangers. He had no surviving relatives in New Orleans to claim his remains or his possessions. His meager belongings were liquidated to cover his outstanding rental obligations. Within a month, it was as though he had never existed. Nevertheless, the deliveries continued. In the years subsequent to Levine's passing, the phenomenon he meticulously documented did not cease. Rather, it intensified across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Enslaved women continued to bear children who possessed fair complexions, and these infants continued to vanish. The subjugated community was cognizant of the unfolding events, even if open discussion was prohibited. They possessed their own channels of information, conveyed through hushed conversations within the quarters after dusk. Warnings were disseminated from one plantation to another via enslaved individuals who were hired out or dispatched on errands. The women who had given birth to these pale-skinned infants carried a particular species of sorrow, a bereavement distinct from the anguish of a child being sold to a distant plantation. These children were not merely absent, they had been expunged, transmuted into something entirely different. And the mothers understood, though they could never articulate it aloud, that their offspring were somewhere in existence, living as white individuals, forever unaware of their origins. This was, in essence, their actual destiny. They were not perishing, they were being clandestinely traded as Caucasian infants. The methodology employed was both astonishingly straightforward and utterly abhorrent. Plantation proprietors who fathered offspring with enslaved women, a common occurrence acknowledged by all but never openly discussed, encountered a quandary. These offspring were legally considered enslaved property, no different from their mothers. However, if they presented with fair complexions, devoid of any discernible traces of African ancestry, they served as a conspicuous reminder of the violation and exploitation inherent in the slave system. They were a source of embarrassment. They complicated the established racial hierarchy upon which the entire economic structure of the South was predicated. An infant possessing a Caucasian appearance yet legally enslaved raised unsettling questions. If such a child could be held in bondage, what did that imply regarding the purported inherent distinctions between races? If children bearing a white semblance could be born to mothers held in servitude, did that not suggest that the racial classifications universally accepted were far more mutable than anyone wished to acknowledge? Moreover, these children represented considerable economic value. A healthy Caucasian infant could command a price 10 times that of an enslaved newborn. And if the child's appearance was sufficiently Caucasian, if no outward sign of African lineage was evident, then who would ever suspect the truth? Consequently, a clandestine network emerged, comprising physicians, midwives, legal practitioners, and traders who specialized in this specific form of transaction. The infants would be taken within days of their birth, prior to their mothers forming significant emotional bonds, and before any individuals outside the plantation could observe them. Fabricated death certificates would be issued, and the infants would be transported to urban centers such as New Orleans, Mobile, Charleston, and Richmond. There they would be placed with Caucasian families desiring children but unable to conceive, or those willing to overlook the child's provenance in exchange for a price significantly lower than that of a formal adoption. This network had existed in some form since the nascent stages of slavery in Louisiana, but it had evolved into a more structured and sophisticated operation by the 1840s. Specific individuals were responsible for each phase of the undertaking. Initially, there were the plantation owners and their overseers who identified which children possessed the potential to pass as Caucasian. Not every child born to an enslaved woman and a Caucasian father met the criteria. Many exhibited clear indications of mixed heritage. However, those children who were sufficiently pale, whose facial features were sufficiently European, and whose hair texture was sufficiently straight, these were the infants earmarked for the network. Secondly, there were the physicians and midwives who facilitated the births and provided the falsified death certificates. Most of these individuals, like Dr. Levine initially, harbored suspicions of impropriety but refrained from probing too deeply due to their reliance on the employment. A select few, however, were active participants who received compensation for their complicity. Thirdly, there were the transporters, men responsible for conveying the infants from the plantations to the cities. They traveled with forged documentation, claiming the infants as their own offspring, or as orphans they were escorting to relatives, or employing any number of other plausible pretexts. The infants were typically administered a dose of laudanum to ensure their quiescence during the journey. Fourthly, there were the legal professionals who generated the fraudulent documentation, including birth certificates, baptismal records, and family Bibles, with entries backdated to lend an air of legitimacy. These individuals were skilled forgers who possessed an acute understanding of the precise documents required to render a child's new identity beyond reproach. Fifthly, there were the brokers who facilitated the connection between the infants and families willing to acquire them. These individuals operated from offices situated within the cities, presenting themselves as intermediaries for private adoptions. They levied substantial fees, occasionally as high as $500 per infant, a sum that represented a year's wages for the majority of the working populace. And finally, there were the families who procured these children. Some of these families genuinely believed they were adopting orphans or infants whose parents had passed away. Others were fully aware of the nature of their purchase and were unconcerned. They desired children, possessed the financial means, and were willing to disregard the attendant circumstances. The entire clandestine operation was shielded by an impenetrable wall of silence. The plantation owners had every incentive to maintain secrecy, as they were effectively disposing of evidence of their own transgressions. The mothers were unable to voice their experiences without risking severe reprisal or even death. The purchasers sought to perpetuate the illusion of legitimacy, and the children themselves possessed no recollection of their origins. It was, in its own peculiar fashion, a perfectly executed crime. The only corroborating evidence resided within the records, and these records were susceptible to destruction or alteration. The sole witnesses were individuals held in servitude whose testimony would never be accorded credence in a court of law. And the only individual who dared to expose this iniquity, Dr. Levine, had been permanently silenced. The system might have endured indefinitely had it not been for a woman named Henriette Delacroix. Henriette was a free woman of color, a rarity in Louisiana during the 1850s. Her mother had been enslaved by a prosperous French Creole merchant named Philippe Descroix, who had subsequently liberated her in his testament and bequeathed her a modest inheritance. Henriette was born into freedom, raised in New Orleans, and received her education from tutors procured by her mother utilizing the inherited funds. In the year 1853, she was 32 years of age, unmarried, and worked as a seamstress, creating attire for affluent Caucasian women. She maintained a small boutique in the French Quarter and was recognized for her exceptional skill with delicate fabrics and intricate embroidery. She resided in a modest apartment situated above her shop, meticulously preserving a dignified and circumspect distance from any controversial matters, and navigating the intricate social fabric of New Orleans with the prudence demanded of all free individuals of color. Free individuals of color in New Orleans occupied a peculiar intermediate status. They were not enslaved, yet they did not possess equality with Caucasians. They were permitted to own property, operate businesses, and even hold individuals in servitude themselves. However, they were disenfranchised, ineligible to serve on juries, and barred from providing testimony against Caucasian individuals in legal proceedings. They were required to carry documentation verifying their free status at all times, and they faced the possibility of being re-enslaved should these documents be lost or challenged. Henriette had a younger sibling named Margot, who in 1853 was 27 years old. Margot, like Henriette, had been born free and pursued a career as a music instructor, providing piano lessons to the daughters of free individuals of color and occasionally to Caucasian families who were willing to overlook her racial background in exchange for her considerable talent. However, in the spring of 1853, Margot's life was irrevocably shattered by a legal technicality. A distant relative of Philippe Descroix, a man named Armand Descroix residing in France who had never encountered Philippe, contested the manumission documents that had liberated Henriette's mother. He contended that Philippe had lacked the legal authority to free an enslaved individual through his will without the assent of his inheritors, and that consequently, the manumission was rendered invalid. The case proceeded to legal arbitration. Henriette engaged the services of the most competent legal counsel she could procure, a free man of color named Victor Seur, who had pursued his legal studies in France. Seur argued with considerable passion that the manumission had been legally enacted under the prevailing statutes at the time that Philip had possessed sound mental faculties when he composed his will, and that challenging it after a lapse of 30 years was an unconscionable act. Nevertheless, the judge, the same Judge Beaumont who had dismissed Dr. Levine's concerns 6 years prior, rendered a judgment in favor of Armand Declassified. He declared that the manumission had been improperly granted and that by extension, Henriette's mother had never legally attained her freedom. Consequently, if the mother had never been free, her children, born to a woman held in servitude, were likewise subjected to enslavement. Overnight, Margot transitioned from a free woman with a profession and a promising future to mere chattel. Henriette, as the elder daughter, should have also been enslaved, but Armand Declassified's legal representative made a strategic calculation. The enslavement of one sister would prove financially advantageous. The enslavement of both, however, would attract undue attention, generate excessive sympathy, and present an elevated risk of public outcry. Therefore, they took Margot, leaving Henriette in freedom, fully aware that the perpetual threat of enslavement would ensure her silence. Margot was subsequently auctioned off 3 days following the judge's ruling. Henriette stood amidst the assembled crowd and witnessed her sister being presented on the block, scrutinized like livestock, and ultimately sold to a plantation owner from St. Charles Parish for $800. The purchaser was an individual named Claude Fourier, the proprietor of one of the most extensive sugar plantations along the German coast. Henriette pursued legal recourse through every available avenue to contest the ruling, but the law was unambiguous. Individuals held in servitude possessed no rights that Caucasians were obligated to respect, and the legal technicality sufficed to legitimize Margot's enslavement. Sir exhausted all possible avenues, including appeals, petitions, and even attempts to solicit funds for the purchase of Margot's freedom, but Fourier adamantly refused to negotiate. He had invested substantial capital in her acquisition and intended to recoup his investment through her labor. In the autumn of 1854, Henriette received intelligence, disseminated through the clandestine network of the enslaved community, that Margot was expecting a child. The purported father, according to the hushed reports, was Claude Fourier himself. Henriette was consumed by a potent mixture of fury and profound helplessness. Her sister, who had once been free, educated, and possessed of a promising future, was now being subjected to the will of the man who had purchased her. In January of 1855, Margot gave birth to a daughter whom she named Henriette. Leveraging her status as a free woman and posing as someone delivering provisions for the enslaved populace, she managed to gain access to the plantation and see her infant niece. She managed to bribe the overseer with $10, a considerable sum for her, in exchange for a single hour alone with Margot. The humble dwelling where Margot resided was indistinguishable from all others within the communal living quarters. It comprised a single room with a packed earth floor, a diminutive fireplace, and a narrow bed. Margot sat upon the bed, cradling her infant daughter. Upon Henriette's entrance, Margot began to weep uncontrollably. "Observe her," Margot whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Henriette, look at her." The infant was pale, possessing features that could plausibly be attributed to Caucasian ancestry. She bore Fourier's nose, his chin, and his light-colored eyes. She possessed a striking beauty, yet her fate was sealed. "They're going to take her," Margot declared. I overheard their hushed conversation, Fourier and the overseer. They spoke of her pallor, deeming her unfit to remain. The plan was to remove her, to declare her deceased. Henriette embraced her niece for an entire hour, imprinting every feature of the child's face onto her memory. The delicate fingers, the downy hair, the soft murmurs she made in her slumber. She offered assurances she knew she couldn't fulfill, recounting to the child the vibrant reality of her mother's life, the music and freedom that should have been hers. 3 days later, Henriette received word that the infant had succumbed to fever. Yet she knew this was a fabrication. She was certain her niece was alive, somewhere, sold into a white family, her very existence being systematically erased. This injustice, she resolved, she would not tolerate. While she couldn't rescue her niece, she could expose this clandestine operation. She could force people to confront the truth. And so, her investigation commenced. She leveraged her connections within the free black community, her relationships with enslaved individuals who served in affluent households, and her own access to privileged spaces as a seamstress who frequented wealthy homes for fittings and measurements. Her inquiries were discreet, her listening keen to whispered rumors. She meticulously gathered scattered pieces of information, each insignificant on its own, but coalescing into a discernible pattern. 2 years elapsed before she fully grasped the extent of the scheme. 2 years dedicated to amassing evidence, locating women who had lost fair-skinned infants, identifying the midwives and physicians who facilitated these exchanges, and unmasking the legal professionals who falsified records and the brokers who trafficked the children. She thoroughly comprehended the intricate network, its operational mechanics, its participants, and the financial transactions involved. She uncovered that this abhorrent practice was not confined to Louisiana. It permeated the entire South, wherever enslaved women bore children who could pass for white. Evidence emerged of children being transported to California, Texas, and even Europe. In the summer of 1856, she found her niece. The child resided with a prosperous white family in the Garden District, being raised as their own daughter. Her name was now Charlotte Beaumont, bearing the same surname as the judge who had ruled against Margot's liberty and dismissed Dr. Levine's concerns. She was 18 months old, healthy, and blissfully unaware that her mother remained enslaved on a plantation upstream, mourning a child she had been informed was deceased. Henriette stood across the street from the Beaumont residence, observing Charlotte play in the garden under the watchful eye of her nurse. The house, a Greek Revival mansion with imposing white columns, overlooked a garden overflowing with roses and camellias. Charlotte, clad in a white linen dress adorned with pink ribbons and her hair tied back with a matching bow, chased a ball across the manicured lawn, her laughter echoing. A profound sorrow welled within Henriette. This child, her niece, her sister's daughter, would experience a life of opulence, utterly oblivious to her origins. She would be raised as white, marry white, and bear white children. The bond with Margot would be irrevocably severed, leaving Margot to endure the remainder of her days in servitude, grieving for a daughter alive, yet effectively lost. Henriette could not reclaim Charlotte. The law offered no recourse, or so it seemed. Even if she could establish the child's lineage, lacking any legal proof beyond the word of enslaved individuals whose testimony held no weight in court, the outcome would be Charlotte's re-enslavement, not a return to Margot. The system was deliberately constructed to thwart such revelations. However, Henriette possessed the means to expose it, to force public awareness. She could create an undeniable record. She began meticulously documenting every facet of her discoveries, recording names, dates, and locations. She sought out other children who had been spirited away to white families, locating 12 in New Orleans alone, and surmising that dozens more existed across the South. She interviewed mothers who had lost their infants, preserving their narratives with painstaking detail. She spoke with midwives coerced into issuing false death certificates. She located a physician, disillusioned by his involvement in the network, willing to provide information provided his identity remained confidential. Her compilation of evidence was a damning indictment detailing plantation owners, legal practitioners, brokers, and the families who had purchased children. It elucidated the entire process from inception to conclusion, estimating that hundreds of children had been abducted and passed off as white over the preceding 2 decades. In March of 1857, she presented her findings to Thomas Whitfield, an editor of a modest abolitionist newspaper titled The Liberator's Voice, which operated at the fringes of legality. Whitfield, a white man from Pennsylvania who had relocated to New Orleans in 1855, was driven by a sincere commitment to abolishing slavery. His publication faced constant threats of closure, and he had endured 2 arrests for disseminating inflammatory material. Whitfield perused Henriette's documentation with mounting horror. Upon completion, he leaned back, fixing his gaze upon her. "If we publish this," he stated slowly, "they will shut us down. They might do worse. They killed that doctor, didn't they? The one you mentioned in your notes." "Yes," Henriette confirmed. "They killed him, and they will kill me if they discover what I know. But someone must speak the truth. These children deserve their stories to be told. Their mothers deserve acknowledgement." Whitfield remained silent for a considerable moment before nodding. "Give me 2 weeks to verify what I can. I'll dispatch someone to examine the parish records. We'll ascertain if the death certificates align with your information. Then we will publish it. Front page, the entire account." But their opportunity never materialized. Just as we believed we had witnessed the zenith of depravity in New Orleans, the horror escalated. If this narrative has sent shivers down your spine, share this video with a friend who relishes macabre mysteries. Please consider liking this video to support our content, and remember to subscribe so you never miss out on similar stories. Let us uncover what unfolds next together. On the 15th of March, 1857, a mere 6 days before Whitfield's newspaper was slated to release Henrietta's exposé, a conflagration erupted in the building housing his printing press. The blaze ignited at 2 o'clock in the morning, a time when the premises should have been deserted, and it consumed the structure with ferocious speed and intensity, strongly suggesting the use of accelerants. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, the entire edifice was engulfed. The building, situated in the American sector near the docks, was in an area characterized by warehouses and workshops. Before the fire could be contained, it spread to 2 adjoining structures, reducing a cooperage and a tobacco warehouse to ashes, in addition to the printing press. Thomas Whitfield's remains were discovered amidst the wreckage the following morning. Apparently, he had returned to his office late at night. Neighbors reported observing a light in the windows around midnight and being trapped when the fire erupted. His body was so severely incinerated that identification was only possible through the distinctive silver watch he wore, recognized by his wife. The official inquiry concluded that a lamp had been overturned, igniting the paper and chemicals utilized in the printing process. The incident was classified as an accidental death, and the case was resolved within a week. All of Whitfield's files, including the documentation provided by Urat, were annihilated. Henriette herself vanished 3 days after the fire. Her shop was found locked, her apartment vacant, her clothing still in the wardrobe, her dishes in the cupboard, yet she was gone. The nearly $200, her entire savings, which she kept concealed in a tin beneath her floorboards, had also disappeared. Some speculated she had fled northward, terrified that whoever had orchestrated Whitfield's demise would target her next. Others whispered that she had met the same fate as Dr. Levine, her body unceremoniously deposited in the river, never to be recovered. A few suggested she had been enslaved, much like her sister, and sold to a distant plantation where no one would recognize her. The reality was more complex. Henrietta had received a warning. The morning following the inferno, she discovered a note slipped beneath her door. Penned on fine paper in an educated hand, it contained no threats or explanations, merely 4 chilling words: "Leave now or die." She heeded the warning with utmost seriousness. She packed a small satchel with clothing, funds, and a duplicate copy of her meticulously gathered documentation. She had learned from Dr. Levine's tragic misstep and ensured she had multiple copies of everything. She departed from New Orleans that very day, abandoning all else. She journeyed northward, navigating a clandestine network of abolitionists and free black communities, moving from one safe house to another, never lingering long enough to be traced. Her travels included a riverboat journey to Memphis, followed by overland travel to Louisville, and then a train ride to Cincinnati. From there, she continued her northward progression to Cleveland, and subsequently eastward to Philadelphia. By the summer of 1857, Henriette had reached Philadelphia, where she adopted the pseudonym Henriette Dubois, attempting to forge a new existence in a city where her past remained unknown. She resumed her work as a seamstress, though she had to rebuild her clientele from scratch. Yet, she could not relinquish the burden of her knowledge. The images of Charlotte and Margot, and the countless other children stolen and transformed, remained etched in her mind. The plight of the mothers, still enduring their grief, still living with the agonizing awareness of their children's existence, yet their permanent loss, haunted her. She endeavored to pique the interest of northern newspapers in her story, but they were preoccupied with more significant national issues: the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, and the escalating tensions between the North and South that presaged impending conflict. The narrative of enslaved children being sold as white was deemed too specific, too intricate, and too readily dismissed as unsubstantiated rumor. "Do you possess proof?" editors would inquire. "Do you have documents, witnesses prepared to testify?" She had documentation, but it consisted of copies of records that had been destroyed. She had witnesses, but they were enslaved individuals whose testimony would be disregarded in any court of law. She had her own observations, but as a black woman, her word alone was insufficient. Nevertheless, Henriette persisted. She refined her documentation, investigated further cases, and constructed an increasingly comprehensive picture of the network. She confirmed that its reach extended far beyond Louisiana, permeating the entire South wherever enslaved women bore children who possessed the ability to pass as white. She discovered that some of these children were transported as far as California, where the gold rush had fueled a population surge and created a desperate demand for labor and families. She found instances of children being shipped to Europe, sold to affluent families seeking American offspring without the encumbrance of legal adoption complexities. The network was vast, sophisticated, and shielded by individuals holding positions of considerable influence within Southern society: judges, lawyers, physicians, and plantation owners. All had a vested interest in its continued secrecy and possessed the power to silence any who threatened its exposure. In 1858, Henriette finally found an ally. A Quaker abolitionist named Rebecca Morris, upon reviewing Henriette's documentation, immediately grasped its profound significance. Rebecca, a widow in her 50s, had dedicated her life to the abolitionist cause. She was affiliated with a Quaker collective meticulously documenting the atrocities of slavery for a forthcoming publication intended for release in London, placing it beyond the jurisdiction of Southern legal systems. The book aimed to galvanize British public opinion against slavery and pressure the British government to endorse abolition in America. "This transcends mere slavery," Rebecca remarked, seated in her Philadelphia parlor with Henriette's papers spread across the table. "This strikes at the very heart of the lie underpinning the entire system. They claim race is immutable, that one can discern ancestry by mere observation, that white and black are distinct, divinely ordained categories. Yet, if enslaved children can be sold as white, if they can grow to have white offspring without anyone detecting the disparity, then the entire racial hierarchy is an elaborate fiction." "Precisely," Henriette concurred. "That is why they will resort to murder to preserve this secret. Because if people comprehend that race is not fixed, that it can be altered, concealed, or manipulated, then the entire justification for slavery collapses." Rebecca belonged to a network of abolitionists dedicated to chronicling the horrors of slavery for a book slated for publication in London. She persuaded Henriette to permit the inclusion of her story within this compilation. They collaborated for months, refining the narrative, substantiating details wherever possible, and preparing the manuscript. Rebecca maintained connections with British publishers sympathetic to the abolitionist movement and was confident in the book's eventual publication and widespread dissemination. However, even as they labored on the manuscript, the network adapted. News had circulated regarding Henrietta's investigation, the near disaster with Whitfield's newspaper, and the nearly published documentation. The individuals orchestrating this operation became more clandestine. They relocated the children to more distant locales, expunged records with greater thoroughness, and eliminated any who posed inconvenient questions. In St. Charles Parish, births continued, but the infants now vanished with even greater celerity, within hours rather than days. Mothers were sometimes immediately separated from their newborns, dispersed to plantations across the South, where any potential for shared experiences or organized resistance was eliminated. The system was consolidating, becoming more efficient and more brutal. Having narrowly escaped exposure, the network implemented measures to ensure its future security. And then the Civil War erupted, altering everything and nothing simultaneously. The clandestine trade in children persisted even as armies traversed the South, as plantations were consumed by flames, and as enslaved individuals sought refuge within Union lines. In certain respects, the ensuing chaos facilitated their operations. Records were destroyed in the conflict, families were displaced, and in the confusion, a fair-skinned child could be moved from one location to another with even less scrutiny than before. However, the war also presented new challenges for the network. Union forces occupying Louisiana commenced investigations into reported discrepancies in plantation records. Agents of the Freedmen's Bureau, tasked with reuniting families fractured by slavery, began inquiring about children who had supposedly died, but whose remains had never been properly accounted for. In 1863, a Union officer named Captain James Hartwell was assigned to investigate reports of missing children in St. Charles Parish. Hartwell, a former lawyer from Massachusetts who had joined the army driven by genuine abolitionist convictions, was 35 years old and a husband with 2 children back in Boston. He approached the assignment with gravity, recognizing, unlike many Union officers, that slavery extended beyond mere labor to encompass the systematic annihilation of families and identities. He commenced his work by scrutinizing parish records, birth certificates, death certificates, and property transfers. He spent weeks within the courthouse in Harnville, poring over dusty ledgers and document boxes. He observed the same anomaly that Dr. Levine had documented 16 years prior, an unusually high incidence of infant mortality among the enslaved population, with virtually no bodies available for examination and no discernible causes of death. The death certificates were remarkably uniform. Fever was the most frequently cited cause, followed by frail constitution and failure to thrive. However, these entries lacked any specific details, descriptions of symptoms, or records of attempted treatments, presenting merely a name, a date, and a cause of death. Hartwell cross-referenced these death certificates with plantation inventories and unearthed further irregularities. In several instances, children purportedly deceased were still listed in plantation inventories months or even years later, indicating either alterations to the records or the recording of different children under identical names. He interviewed formerly enslaved individuals who had escaped to Union lines. Many were hesitant to speak, fearing that discussing the children might inadvertently endanger them further. However, Hartwell gradually pieced together the narrative. An elderly woman named Ruth, the same Ruth who had assisted Dr. Levine, divulged everything. Dying of consumption, coughing blood into a handkerchief as she spoke, she expressed a desire for someone to know the truth before her passing. "I helped deliver more than 200 babies in my life," Ruth stated, her voice a mere whisper. "And I watched dozens of them disappear. The pale ones, the ones who looked white. They'd be born and I'd clean them and wrap them. Then the overseer would take them away. The mothers would weep, but there was nothing they could do. Nothing any of us could do." "Where did the children go?" Hartwell inquired. "I don't know for certain," Ruth replied. "But I overheard things. The overseers would sometimes converse when they believed we couldn't hear. They spoke of families in the city who desired children, of lawyers who could procure documentation, and of the substantial sums each child commanded, sometimes hundreds of dollars. More than I had ever seen in my lifetime." "Do you recall any names? Any specific individuals involved?" Ruth provided names: plantation owners, overseers, a physician who succeeded Levine after his death, and a New Orleans lawyer specializing in private adoptions. She furnished dates, described the process as she understood it, and informed Hartwell about the mothers who were still alive, continuing to mourn for infants they were told had died. "They took hundreds of children," Ruth told Hartwell.
Hundreds, and those children are out there somewhere, living as white, never knowing their origins. Their mothers are still alive, some still grieving, perpetually wondering if their babies are safe, if they are loved, if they ever contemplate the women who gave them birth." Hartwell was appalled. He immediately commenced compiling a report for his superiors, detailing his findings and advocating for a comprehensive investigation.
He intended to locate the children, reunite them with their mothers if feasible, and prosecute those responsible for operating the network. However, before he could submit his report, he received orders transferring him to Virginia. The transfer was abrupt, unexpected, and conveyed a clear directive from his commanding officer: abandon the investigation. Colonel Morrison stated when Hartwell protested, "We are engaged in a war to win and preserve the Union. We cannot afford to initiate something this complex at this juncture." "But the children are gone," Morrison interrupted, "scattered across the country, living new lives. What do you suppose will happen if you expose this? You will dismantle families, ruin lives, create chaos. And for what purpose? You cannot undo what has been done. You cannot restore those children's original identities. They are white now. For all practical intents and purposes, let it rest. But the individuals responsible should be prosecuted." "For what?" Morrison countered. "For selling property they legally owned, for forging documents. Do you genuinely believe any court will convict affluent white men for crimes perpetrated against enslaved individuals? Even if we prevail in this war and abolish slavery, do you imagine anyone will care about the fate of a few hundred children? Hartwell desired to contest the decision, but he comprehended the political calculus at play. The Union required the support of moderate Northerners, individuals willing to fight for the preservation of the Union, but not necessarily committed to achieving racial equality. The emergence of a scandal concerning white households that had unknowingly taken in children who were once enslaved would have ignited a political firestorm. Such a revelation would have prompted profound questions about racial identity, the legitimacy of family structures, and the very foundations of the societal order. It was deemed more expedient to let the matter rest, to simply ignore its existence, and to divert attention towards the ongoing war, deferring these complex issues for a future reckoning. Consequently, the inquiry was discreetly set aside. Hartwell was reassigned to Virginia, where he served with considerable honor for another year. He met his end at the Battle of Cold Harbor in June of 1864, struck in the chest by a bullet while leading a charge against entrenched Confederate positions. His research notes pertaining to the missing children were carefully bundled with his personal belongings and dispatched to his family in Boston. There they languished for decades in an attic, unexamined and forgotten. Ruth passed away a mere 2 weeks following her conversation with Hartwell. She was interred in a communal burial site alongside other individuals formerly bound by slavery who had perished in the contraband camps. Her name was duly recorded in a ledger, a document destined to be lost to time. The war concluded, and slavery was subsequently abolished. The Freedmen's Bureau made efforts to reunite families, but their focus was primarily on individuals who had been sold away, not on children who had been forcibly taken and their identities deliberately altered. The mothers who had lost children with pale complexions possessed no legal avenues for redress, no means to substantiate what had transpired. They had no way to locate their offspring, even if the inclination had been present, and for the most part, the desire was absent. What would be the purpose? Their children were now perceived as white, leading lives that were entirely white. To expose the truth would only serve to shatter these existing realities. It would label them as black in a society that, if anything, was becoming more rigidly stratified. It would strip them of their social standing, their marital unions, and their futures. Thus, the mothers remained silent. They bore their grief in solitude, carried their losses inwardly, and never spoke of the children who had been wrested from them. The clandestine network gradually disbanded as the institution of slavery drew to a close and the legal framework that had underpinned it ceased to exist. Nevertheless, the children persisted, dispersed throughout the nation, their origins concealed. Some among them eventually came to know the truth, a deathbed confession from an adoptive parent, a letter unearthed by chance, a serendipitous encounter with someone privy to the narrative. However, the majority remained unaware. They lived and died under the firm conviction of their whiteness, and their progeny and grandchildren had no reason whatsoever to harbor any doubts. Margot, Henriette's sister, gained her freedom upon the war's conclusion. She remained at the Fortier plantation for a few years, employed as a paid laborer, having no other destination and no family to whom she could return. Henriette had dispatched letters in an attempt to locate her, but they never managed to connect. The postal system in the South was in a state of disarray in the aftermath of the war, and correspondence frequently went astray. In 1870, Margot succumbed to pneumonia. She was 44 years of age. She had never remarried, nor had she borne any other children, and she had spent the concluding 15 years of her existence mourning the daughter who had been taken from her. She was laid to rest in a modest cemetery near the plantation, her grave marked by a simple wooden cross that succumbed to decay within a few years. She never learned that her daughter had indeed lived, that Charlotte had been raised within a prosperous white family just a few miles distant in New Orleans, that she had been afforded every conceivable advantage, educated at the most esteemed institutions, and presented to society as the daughter of Judge Beaumont. Charlotte Beaumont, the very same Charlotte whom Henriette had encountered in the Garden District 20 years prior, passed away during childbirth in New Orleans in 1879. She was 25 years old, wedded to a prosperous merchant named Edward Clark, and had never known that her mother was an enslaved woman by the name of Margot, who had died on a plantation in 1870, still consumed by grief for the daughter she had held for merely 3 hours. Charlotte's demise was deeply lamented by the society of New Orleans. She was entombed in a distinguished mausoleum at Metairie Cemetery, her grave graced by a marble angel. Her obituary in the Times-Picayune described her as a cherished daughter of one of our city's most distinguished families, taken from us far too soon. Charlotte's offspring, 2 daughters aged 3 and 5 respectively, grew up white, married white individuals, and subsequently had white children of their own. The secret effectively vanished with the generation that had perpetuated it, or so it was universally believed. Henriette Descroix lived until 1889, passing away in Philadelphia at the age of 68. She had never ceased documenting instances of abducted children, despite her awareness that her endeavors would likely yield no form of justice. She had never married, nor had she any children of her own, dedicating the final 30 years of her life to compiling a record of the events that had transpired. Her papers, discovered after her passing by the Quaker community that had provided her support, contained accounts of over 300 cases spanning 7 southern states. She meticulously recorded births, disappearances, and the ultimate fates of children she had managed to trace. She had constructed a genealogy of stolen identities, a cartographical representation of families that had been sundered and subsequently reassembled into new configurations. The Quakers preserved her extensive collection of documents, recognizing their profound historical importance. They were eventually bequeathed to the Library Company of Philadelphia, where they resided within the archives, occasionally consulted by scholars, but never widely disseminated to the public. The narrative might well have remained interred within those archives had it not been for a sequence of events that commenced in 1979, precisely 132 years after the demise of Dr. Augustus Levine. Dr. Patricia Jennings was a historian specializing in the medical practices prevalent in antebellum Louisiana. She was 42 years old, a professor at Tulane University, and was engaged in the composition of a book concerning plantation medicine. For months, she had been conducting research within the New Orleans Municipal Archives, sifting through numerous boxes of historical documents that had been donated by various families over the years. The majority of this material was of a routine nature: property deeds, transaction receipts, personal correspondence, the commonplace paperwork that defined daily existence in the 19th century. However, within a box designated as Beaumont Family Papers 1840-1880, she encountered something truly extraordinary. It was a ledger bound in leather, exhibiting signs of water damage and fragility, its pages adhering to one another and rendering sections of it partially illegible. Jennings immediately recognized it as a medical ledger, discerning entries detailing patients, treatments administered, and associated fees. Yet, as she meticulously began to separate the pages, she realized the significance of her discovery far exceeded mere medical record-keeping. This was Dr. Augustus Levine's original ledger, the very document that had been presumed lost upon his death. Jennings dedicated 3 months to the painstaking process of separating the pages and transcribing all that she could decipher. Although the water damage had rendered some entries entirely indecipherable, a sufficient amount remained to narrate a compelling story. 47 births were recorded, each accompanied by a description of pale-skinned infants born to enslaved mothers, followed by 47 suspicious fatalities. But there was more. Tucked between the pages, she discovered a collection of letters. These included pleas from Levine to Judge Beaumont urging an investigation, and letters from Beaumont to Levine cautioning him to cease his persistent inquiries. Finally, there was a single missive dated October 26, 1847, the day preceding the discovery of Levine's body in the river. This letter was addressed to "My dear sister Margaret." Although Jennings's research indicated that Levine's only sister had died in childhood, the misdirection was clearly a deliberate precaution. Should the letter be intercepted, it would appear as personal correspondence rather than incriminating evidence of a crime. In this letter, Levine meticulously detailed all that he had unearthed. He named the plantation owners implicated, the overseers who facilitated the illicit transfers, and the legal professionals who fabricated the requisite documents. He elaborated on the intricate network, explicitly stating that Judge Beaumont himself was among its principal architects. "I have documented 47 cases," Levine wrote, "but I believe there are many more. This is not an isolated practice but a systematic operation involving some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Louisiana. They are stealing children from their mothers and selling them as white, erasing their identities and their histories for profit." He proceeded to outline his intended course of action. He intended to present his evidence to a New York newspaper, thereby placing it beyond the reach of Louisiana's jurisdiction. He planned to depart New Orleans the following day, traveling by steamboat to Memphis and subsequently overland to New York. He had already established contact with an editor at the New York Tribune, who had agreed to publish his findings. "If you are reading this," the letter concluded, "it means they have killed me, but at least the truth will survive. These children deserve to have their stories told. Their mothers deserve to be acknowledged, and the men who did this deserve to be exposed, even if they are never punished." Jennings sat in the archive's reading room, clutching the fragile letter, and felt an icy chill permeate her spine. This was not merely a historical curiosity, it was irrefutable evidence of a colossal crime, a meticulously organized operation that had resulted in the abduction of hundreds of children and the obliteration of their identities. She immediately commenced further research. She unearthed records pertaining to Levine's demise, the cursory inquiry, and his hasty burial. She discovered references to Judge Beaumont's illustrious career, his considerable wealth, and his esteemed position within New Orleans society. She located property records confirming that Beaumont owned a residence in the Garden District, the very same house where Henriette had observed Charlotte playing in the garden. Furthermore, she found adoption records, or rather, the conspicuous absence thereof. In the 1850s, Louisiana lacked formal adoption statutes. Children were transferred between families through private agreements with minimal accompanying documentation. This provided the ideal system for concealing the origins of abducted children. Jennings published her findings in an academic journal in 1981. The article, titled "The Hidden Traffic, Child Theft, and Racial Passing in Antebellum Louisiana," generated a moderate stir within historical circles. It was subsequently featured in a few newspapers, discussed at academic conferences, and cited in the works of other scholars, but it failed to reach a broader audience. The families named in Levine's ledger were long deceased. The plantations had been bought and sold multiple times over, and most individuals dismissed the matter as a tragic, yet isolated incident, a dark chapter of history safely consigned to the past. However, Jennings persisted in her investigations. She journeyed to Philadelphia and discovered Henrietta Delacroix's papers within the archives of the library company. She tracked down Captain Hartwell's notes among his family's possessions in Boston. She conducted interviews with descendants of enslaved individuals from St. Charles Parish, some of whom still recounted tales of the pale-skinned children who had vanished. She then embarked on an endeavor to locate these children, or more accurately, their descendants. Employing genealogical records, DNA testing, and painstaking historical research, Jennings identified 17 families across Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama who were descended from children who had been sold into whiteness. Some of these families expressed profound shock at the revelation. Others harbored suspicions but had never possessed concrete proof. A select few had been privy to the truth for generations, but maintained their silence, apprehensive of the social repercussions. One such family was the Beaumont lineage. Judge Beaumont's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Elizabeth Beaumont Clark, consented to speak with Jennings in 1985. Elizabeth, then 62 years of age, was a retired schoolteacher residing in Baton Rouge. She presented as white, with fair skin and light brown hair, and had grown up under the firm belief of her purely European ancestry. However, her grandmother had imparted a different narrative to her. "My grandmother told me when I was 16, Elizabeth recounted, seated with Jennings in her living room. She said our family held a secret and that I needed to know it before she passed away. She told me about Charlotte, about how she had been purchased as an infant, and how the judge had orchestrated the entire affair." "How did you feel when you learned?" Jennings inquired. Elizabeth fell silent for a considerable moment, her gaze fixed on her garden through the window. "I felt as though my entire identity was a fabrication," she finally stated. "I had grown up believing I understood who I was, where I originated from. I had been educated about my family's history, about our French and Spanish ancestors, about our standing in New Orleans society. And then I discovered that my great-great-grandmother had been enslaved, that she had been stolen from her mother, and that everything I had been told about my family's history was untrue. Did it alter how you perceived yourself?" "Yes and no," Elizabeth replied. "I still looked the same. I still possessed the same memories, the same relationships. But I felt as though I was perpetuating a falsehood, as though I was masquerading as someone I was not. And I did not know what to do with that knowledge." Whom was I expected to inform? What actions was I supposed to take? Did you ever attempt to find Charlotte's mother's family? "I did try," Elizabeth affirmed, "but the records were destroyed during the war, and there was no way to trace Margot's descendants. If she had other children, I have no knowledge of their whereabouts. I do not know if I have cousins out there who are black, who might be descended from the same woman. It is as though that segment of my history has been utterly obliterated." She paused, then added, "And I contemplate Charlotte sometimes about the life she led. Did she ever harbor suspicions? Did she ever feel as though she did not quite belong? Or did she live her entire existence believing herself to be white, never questioning it? I will never know." Jennings's research revealed that this was a common outcome. The clandestine network had been meticulously designed to sever all connections between the children and their ancestral origins. Even when descendants learned the truth, they were typically unable to trace their lineage far enough back to locate their enslaved relatives. The documentation had been too thoroughly destroyed, the connections too completely severed. the system had functioned precisely as intended. It had transformed children who were legally classified as black into white individuals, eradicating their histories so completely that even modern genealogical tools were incapable of fully reconstructing them. In 1987, Jennings published a book titled Stolen Children: The Hidden History of Racial Passing in the Antebellum South. It was characterized by extensive research, meticulous documentation, and a deeply unsettling narrative. It chronicled the accounts of Dr. Levine, Henriette Delacroix, Captain Hartwell, and the hundreds of children who had been abducted and sold under the guise of being white. The book received favorable reviews in academic journals and garnered some attention in the mainstream press. The New York Times featured an extensive article about it, and Jennings appeared on several radio programs to expound upon her findings. However, the story did not elicit the widespread public outcry that Jennings had hoped for. A contributing factor was the timing. The book was released in 1987 during the Reagan era, a period when discussions concerning race and history were frequently dismissed as divisive or unnecessary. Many individuals held the view that slavery was a matter of the past, that it was time to move forward, and that unearthing past injustices only served to create further complications. Another element contributing to the limited impact was the inherent nature of the story itself. It was intricate, involving legal complexities and genealogical research that proved challenging for general readers to fully comprehend. Furthermore, it posed uncomfortable questions that many preferred not to confront. If hundreds of children had been abducted and sold as white, how many of their descendants were alive today? How many white Americans might possess enslaved ancestors without their knowledge? What implications did this hold for racial identity, for family histories, and for the very concept of race itself? These were questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about identity and belonging, and a significant number of people simply lacked the inclination to engage with them. Nevertheless, the book did resonate with some individuals. Descendants of the abducted children began to contact Jennings, sharing their own family narratives and seeking assistance in tracing their ancestry. Some had always harbored a sense of unease regarding their family history, noting discrepancies in records, inconsistencies in accounts, or physical features that seemed incongruous with their purported lineage. One such individual was Sarah Mitchell, who contacted Jennings in 2015, nearly 30 years after the book's publication. Sarah had grown up in Atlanta within a white family, possessing no reason to question her ancestry. However, upon undertaking a DNA test out of curiosity, the results revealed a small but undeniable percentage of African ancestry, approximately 12%, suggesting that one of her great-great-grandparents had been of African descent. Initially, she dismissed this as an error or a distant ancestor unknown to her. However, she subsequently commenced researching her family history and uncovered gaps in the existing records. Her great-great-grandmother had appeared in New Orleans in 1855 as a young child, with no clear documentation of her birth or parentage. The prevailing family narrative asserted that she had been orphaned, yet there were no death certificates for her supposed parents, nor any records attesting to their existence. Sarah dedicated 2 years to meticulously tracing records, collaborating with genealogists and historians, and eventually discovered her great-great-great-grandmother's name within Dr. Levine's ledger. The child had been born to an enslaved woman named Josephine on the Hardle plantation in May of 1847. She was sold to a family in New Orleans at the tender age of 3 days, given the name Emily Harper, and raised as white. "I am uncertain of how to feel about this," Sarah shared with a reporter in 2017, following the feature of her story in a documentary examining racial identity in America. Part of me feels as though I have unearthed this significant truth about my identity, yet another part of me feels as though I have lost something. My entire understanding of my family, my identity, my place in the world, it is all fundamentally altered now. Have you attempted to locate Josephine's other descendants? The reporter inquired. I have, Sarah responded. But the records are exceedingly fragmented. I am aware that Josephine had other children prior to the one who became Emily Harper, but they were all sold away. I have no knowledge of their destinations or their fates. I have connected with a few individuals who may be distant cousins, but we lack the evidence to confirm it. The documentation simply does not exist. She paused, then added, and I cannot even locate Josephine's descendants, should she have had any others. That segment of my family is simply gone, erased, and I will never be able to recover it. Sarah's narrative was showcased in a PBS documentary titled A Question of Belonging, which aired in 2018. The documentary delved into the enduring legacy of slavery and the mechanisms through which racial categories had been constructed and perpetuated via legal statutes and societal customs. Sarah's story served as one of several case studies, reaching a wider audience than Jennings's book ever had. Following the documentary's broadcast, dozens of individuals contacted the producers, reporting similar lacunae in their family histories, analogous unexplained DNA results, and parallel narratives of children who had emerged without clear origins. Some had been engaged in genealogical research for years, striving to comprehend the inconsistencies within their family accounts. Others had only recently begun to question their identities after undergoing DNA testing. The documentary estimated that potentially hundreds of thousands of Americans could be descended from children who were stolen and sold as white, the vast majority of them completely unaware of their true ancestry. The clandestine network had been so remarkably effective, so assiduous in its eradication of records and identities, that the complete extent of its operations may never be definitively known. Dr. Patricia Jennings passed away in 2003, still actively engaged in the development of a follow-up book intended to broaden her research to encompass other Southern states. She had identified over 200 instances of children who had been sold as white and harbored the conviction that there were thousands more who had left no discernible paper trail. Her research papers were subsequently donated to Tulane University, where they remain accessible to scholars engaged in the study of the history of slavery and racial identity in America. This collection encompasses facsimiles of Dr. Levine's ledger, Henriette Delacroix's meticulously compiled documentation, Captain Hartwell's investigative notes, and hundreds of pages comprising Jennings's own research, including interviews, genealogical charts, analyses of parish records, and correspondence with descendants of the abducted children. In St. Charles Parish, a modest museum now stands dedicated to the history of slavery in Louisiana. Nestled within a renovated plantation estate, this place chronicles the lives of those once held in bondage, detailing their arduous labor and daily existence. In one section, an exhibit delves into the work of Dr. Augustus Levine and his efforts to rescue children. It showcases facsimiles of his account book entries, images of the plantations where births occurred, and a roster of names: mothers who mourned lost offspring, children who were abducted, and the families who acquired them. The display culminates with a prominent question displayed on the wall. How many more narratives like this are obscured within our past? How many more young lives were deliberately omitted? How many more family units were shattered by an institution that viewed human beings as mere commodities? No definitive answer is offered, leaving the query suspended, prompting visitors to contemplate its weight. The museum also features a commemorative wall bearing the names of mothers who were separated from their children. These names were gathered from Dr. Levine's ledger, Riet de Cross's records, and local church registries. Over 300 names adorn the wall, each representing a woman who brought a child into the world, only for that child to be taken and sold as white. Celeste, Josephine, Marie, Margot, Ruth, and countless others whose identities have faded into obscurity. Visitors often pause before this wall for extended periods, absorbing the names, attempting to envision the lives they represent. Some are moved to tears, others capture the moment with their cameras, while many simply stand in quiet contemplation, bearing witness to an unpunished transgression and an unacknowledged sorrow. The account of the Pale Children of New Orleans serves as a stark reminder that history transcends the mere passage of time. It speaks to the present, illustrating how past injustices continue to mold our world in subtle, often unseen ways. It concerns identities that were stripped away, familial bonds that were severed, and truths so deeply buried that we are still unearthing them. The clandestine network responsible for these abductions was a direct product of slavery. Yet, its repercussions extended across generations, forging an intricate, hidden tapestry of lineage that even contemporary genetic analysis struggles to fully unravel. The children relinquished as white went on to have offspring, who in turn had children and their descendants. Today, somewhere in America, individuals may be unaware that their ancestors were born into servitude on Louisiana plantations. They grew up believing themselves to be white, married white partners, had white children, and lived their entire lives without ever knowing their true origins. In most instances, this knowledge will remain forever out of reach. Records have been lost, connections broken, and the truth concealed too thoroughly to retrieve. Nevertheless, truth endures even when it remains unseen. The mothers existed, the children existed, the sorrow existed, and the crime existed, even though no one was ever held accountable. This enigma reveals that the most harrowing aspects of slavery were not always the most conspicuous. Sometimes the barbarity lay in the obliteration of identity and family, in the meticulous dismantling of lineage, and in the fabrication of a deception so profound it became indistinguishable from reality. The abducted children did not merely lose their freedom, they forfeited their histories, their identities, and their connections to those who cherished them. They were fundamentally altered into something they were not, and they never even realized it. Their mothers, however, lived with this painful awareness for the remainder of their lives. They knew their children were alive somewhere, living as others, and that they would never see them again, never embrace them, never reveal the truth. They bore this anguish in silence, as any vocalization would have invited retribution. The system that perpetrated this atrocity was engineered for concealment, to operate surreptitiously, leaving no discernible trace. And it nearly succeeded. Had it not been for Dr. Levine's diligent record-keeping, for Henry at Deoqua's unwavering resolve, for Captain Hartwell's thorough investigation, for Dr. Jennings's painstaking research, this story could have been lost forever. Yet the truth persevered. Not wholly intact, not entirely complete, but sufficient to illuminate what transpired, sufficient to honor the mothers who endured such profound loss, sufficient to acknowledge the children who were taken, sufficient to remind us that history is replete with unpunished offenses, unrectified injustices, and truths that, while buried, were never entirely annihilated. What are your thoughts on this narrative? Do you believe all aspects have been brought to light? How many more children do you surmise were abducted and passed off as white? How many descendants of those children are alive today, oblivious to their genuine heritage? Share your reflections in the comments section below. If this account resonated with you and you seek more such chilling narratives, please subscribe, activate the notification bell, and share it with enthusiasts of mysteries. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.